The monitors screamed a symphony of failure. Each shrill alarm was a nail in the coffin of the man on the operating table, and a death knell for the reputation of the surgeon presiding over the chaos. Dr. Alistair Finch, golden boy of St. Jude's Medical Center, was drowning. His handsome face, usually a mask of arrogant confidence, was slick with a desperate sweat. His commands were a frantic spray of contradictions. More lap pads. No suction. God, I can't see anything. Where's all this blood coming from? His voice, normally a smooth baritone used to charm donors and intimidate interns, was a high-pitched, panicked thing. The surgical team, a well-oiled machine under normal circumstances, had seized up, their movements made hesitant and clumsy by their leader's unraveling. They looked at him, searching for the god of the OR they'd been taught he was, and found only a terrified man in expensive scrubs. In the corner of the room, tasked with fetching another box of sutures, stood Evelyn Reed. To Dr. Finch, she was just part of the background scenery, a piece of hospital equipment with a name tag. She was the old ward nurse, the one with the tired eyes and the quiet, almost apologetic way of moving. He'd noticed her earlier, her worn-down shoes a stark offense next to his own gleaming Italian leather clogs. He'd barked at her then, and he barked at her now. "You, nurse, get out of my OR. We don't need a spectator gallery for your retirement planning," he shrieked, whirling on her, needing a target for the acid of his own failure. Evelyn's face remained a stoic mask, a landscape weathered by storms he couldn't possibly imagine. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. Her gaze was fixed not on him, but on the vitals monitor, where the patient's blood pressure was tracing a path to oblivion. 60/40. Now 55/38. A flat line was seconds away. The man on the table was no ordinary patient. He was a VIP, airlifted in with the kind of priority that made hospital administrators tremble. A decorated general, a man of strategic national importance. And now, under the supposedly brilliant hands of Dr. Finch, he was dying. As the chaos reached its crescendo, a strange and impossible thing happened. The general, lost in a sea of anesthesia and trauma, stirred. A flicker of consciousness, a final spark of will against the encroaching darkness. His eyes, unfocused, scanned the room, past the panicked face of Dr. Finch, past the frantic nurses. They found Evelyn. They locked onto her as a drowning man locks onto a lighthouse. A moment of recognition cut through the haze of pain. His throat worked, a dry, rasping sound escaping his lips. It was barely a whisper, yet it sliced through the electronic din of the alarms with the force of a thunderclap. "Nightingale? Is that you?" The room went utterly still. The frantic movements ceased. The panicked chatter died. Even the relentless beeping of the monitors seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Finch stared, his mouth agape. Nightingale? What in God's name was a nightingale? It sounded like a code from a cheap spy movie. He looked from the dying general to the old nurse. Her expression hadn't changed, but her eyes... Something in her eyes had shifted. The quiet weariness was gone, replaced by a glacial stillness, the calm at the center of a hurricane. He thought she was just a useless old nurse, a relic from a bygone era of medicine. He thought she was someone he could humiliate for sport, a stepping stone to burnish his own fragile ego. He was wrong. He was dead wrong. And in the silence of that operating room, with a hero's life hanging by a thread, Dr. Alistair Finch was about to learn a lesson written in blood and sacrifice, a lesson about the true nature of authority and the quiet, terrifying power of a ghost who had finally been called by her name. The reckoning had arrived. 6 hours earlier, The halls of St. Jude's Medical Center had hummed with their usual controlled purpose. The air smelled of money, a sterile blend of high-grade antiseptic, and the faint, expensive perfume of the wealthy patrons who walked its marble floors. Sunlight streamed through vast, floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off polished steel and glass, making the entire building feel less like a place of sickness and more like a temple to modern medicine. It was a world of pristine surfaces and calculated efficiency, a place where appearances mattered above all else. In this gleaming world, Evelyn Reed was a smudge of imperfection. Her rounds began before the sun had fully risen, a quiet ritual of care that went largely unnoticed. She moved through the pre-dawn quiet of the wards like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by the soft soles of her practical, worn-out shoes. She checked IV drips, her fingers moving with an economy that spoke of 30 years of practice. She adjusted pillows for sleeping patients, her touch gentle, almost reverent. She spoke in low, soothing tones, a calming presence in a place humming with latent anxiety. To the bustling daytime staff, she was Evelyn, or more often just the nurse in room 304. The younger nurses, fresh from university with their bright scrubs and brighter ambitions, treated her with a kind of condescending patience. They saw her meticulous, handwritten notes as quaint, her deliberate pace as slow, her quiet demeanor as a lack of confidence. She was a relic, a holdover from an analog age in their digital world. They didn't see the way her eyes, tired as they were, caught the subtle details they missed. In room 312, a post-operative patient's breathing hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible stutter. The state-of-the-art pulmonary monitor registered no change, but Evelyn, standing by the bedside, heard it. She saw the minute tensing of the muscles in the man's neck. Without a word, she gently shifted his position, tilting his head just so, propping a pillow beneath his shoulder. The stutter in his breath smoothed out. His oxygen saturation, which had been about to dip, climbed back to a perfect 99%. She made a small note on his chart and moved on. No one saw, no one knew. And that was how she preferred it. Anonymity was a balm for a soul scorched by too much responsibility, too much life and death held in her hands. The calm of the morning was shattered by the arrival of Dr. Alistair Finch. He didn't walk onto the ward. He made an entrance. A coterie of wide-eyed interns trailed in his wake like pilotfish following a shark. He was everything St. Jude's valued. Young, handsome, exuding an aura of effortless brilliance. His scrubs were tailored, his Rolex a casual flash of wealth, his smile a weapon he deployed with surgical precision. "Morning, everyone," he announced, his voice booming with a bonhomie that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's see if we can't save some lives before lunch, shall we?" The interns chuckled dutifully. Finch's eyes scanned the nurse's station and landed on a junior nurse, a young woman named Chloe, who was nervously fumbling with the patient's chart. "Nurse," he said, the smile vanishing. "Is there a problem with Mr. Henderson's post-op orders?" No, doctor," Chloe stammered, her face flushing. "I was just double-checking the dosage for his anticoagulant." Finch snatched the chart from her hands. He glanced at it for half a second. "The dosage is written in plain English. Are you having trouble reading? Or is basic pharmacology beyond the scope of your training?" The public humiliation was swift and brutal. Chloe shrank under the force of his disdain, her eyes filling with tears. "No, sir. I'm sorry, doctor." "Don't be sorry. Be competent," he sneered, handing the chart to one of his interns. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. Precision, confidence. There is no room for hesitation in my hospital." He emphasized the word my, a subtle reminder that his father sat on the board of directors. From a few feet away, another intern, Sarah Jenkins, watched the exchange with a knot of anger tightening in her stomach. Sarah was idealistic, still clinging to the belief that medicine was a noble calling, not a blood sport. She hated the way Finch wielded his power, the casual cruelty he mistook for strength. Her eyes drifted past him, to the quiet figure of Evelyn Reed, who was now calmly restocking a supply cart. Evelyn hadn't reacted to Finch's outburst. She just continued her work, her face a placid lake. Sarah found it strange. Everyone else on the floor either feared Finch or worshipped him. Evelyn seemed indifferent. It was as if a king were preening and strutting, and one of his subjects simply didn't notice he was in the room. This quiet, old nurse, Sarah thought, was more interesting than she appeared. The first real confrontation came just before noon. A patient in the cardiac step-down unit, a man in his 70s recovering from a valve replacement Finch had performed 2 days prior, suddenly became agitated and short of breath. His heart rate spiked. The floor nurse paged Dr. Finch, her voice tight with panic. Evelyn was the first to respond. She was just down the hall, helping another patient with their lunch tray, when she heard the alarm from the man's room. She entered calmly. The patient was thrashing slightly, his face pale and clammy. He was complaining of a sharp, itching sensation all over his torso. Evelyn's eyes did a rapid, systematic sweep. The patient's chart, the IV stand, the monitor. It took her less than 5 seconds. The patient had been started on a new, broad-spectrum antibiotic an hour ago as a prophylactic measure. His symptoms weren't cardiac. It was a classic anaphylactic reaction, severe but manageable if treated immediately. While the other nurse was still on the phone, Evelyn had already stopped the antibiotic drip. She grabbed a vial of epinephrine and a syringe from the room's crash cart, drawing up the correct dose with steady hands. "Get me a full anaphylaxis tray and page the rapid response team," she said to the other nurse, her voice low but firm. "Tell them potential airway compromise." Just as she was about to administer the epinephrine, Dr. Finch swept into the room, his face a thundercloud. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. "The patient is having a severe allergic reaction to the new antibiotic, doctor," Evelyn stated, not looking at him, her focus entirely on the man in the bed. Finch didn't even glance at the patient. His eyes were fixed on the syringe in Evelyn's hand. He saw a floor nurse, his floor nurse, about to administer a powerful drug without his direct order. His authority was being challenged. "Put that down," he commanded, his voice dripping with ice. "Now." Evelyn paused, her hand hovering over the patient's thigh. "Doctor, he's progressing to anaphylactic shock. He needs epinephrine immediately." "I will be the judge of that," Finch snarled. He strode to the bedside, deliberately turning his back on Evelyn. He grabbed the patient's wrist, pretending to check his pulse, ignoring the obvious rash now blooming across the man's chest. "He's tachycardic from post-op anxiety." "You were about to inject a man having a panic attack with adrenaline? Are you insane?" He turned on her, his voice rising, playing to the audience of the terrified family huddled in the corner and the other nurse who had just returned. "You are a glorified maid, Nurse Reed. You change sheets and you take temperatures. You do not diagnose, you do not prescribe, and you certainly do not practice medicine in my unit. Is that clear?" Evelyn stood frozen for a beat, the syringe still in her hand. The patient let out a wheezing gasp. Her training, her very soul, screamed at her to ignore this arrogant fool and save the man's life. But a deeper, more exhausted part of her, the part that had chosen this quiet life, won out. She slowly, deliberately, placed the syringe back on the cart. "Yes, doctor," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Finch smirked, victorious. He then ordered a mild sedative for the patient, a move so catastrophically wrong it was like throwing gasoline on a fire. As the sedative began to depress the man's already struggling respiratory system, Finch finally noticed the wheezing. His eyes widened in a flicker of panic before his arrogance reasserted itself. He barked at the other nurse to administer the epinephrine, as if it had been his idea all along. Evelyn turned and walked out of the room. The public dressing down, the blatant incompetence, the near disaster, it all washed over her. As she walked down the hallway, her right hand slipped unconsciously inside her scrub top, her fingers finding the cool, familiar shape of a small, worn steel pin. It was a stylized nightingale, its edges softened by years of touch. The metal was a conduit to another life. For a fleeting second, she wasn't in the pristine, quiet hallway of St. Jude's. She was in a dusty, blood-soaked tent in the Afghan desert. The air was thick with the smell of sand and cordite. The sounds weren't beeps, but the screams of wounded men. The weight in her arms wasn't a lunch tray, but a young ranger, his body shattered, begging her not to let him die. She had held his hand, looked him in the eye, and lied to him. Told him he was going to be okay, while her other hand worked desperately to clamp an artery she knew was already beyond repair. This humiliation, here in this palace of healing, it was nothing. A ghost's whisper. She let her hand drop and continued down the hall, her limp, usually so subtle, now a little more pronounced. Sarah Jenkins had watched the entire scene unfold from the doorway. She had seen Evelyn's correct diagnosis, Finch's arrogant dismissal, and his desperate face-saving reversal. She saw the quiet dignity with which Evelyn absorbed the abuse, and she saw the brief, almost imperceptible touch to her chest, a gesture of self-comfort that seemed profound and mysterious. Sarah felt a hot surge of rage on Evelyn's behalf, mixed with a dawning, powerful curiosity. Who was this woman? The afternoon brought organized chaos. A multi-car pileup on the interstate turned the St. Jude's emergency department into a war zone. Gurneys lined the hallways, the air thick with the cries of the injured and the urgent shouts of medical staff. The hospital's mass casualty incident plan was activated, and every available hand was called to the ER. Dr. Finch, as the lead attending surgeon on call, was supposed to be the calm center of this storm. Instead, he was a whirlwind of frantic, ineffective energy. He strode through the ER, not directing, but performing. He barked orders that were immediately countermanded by the unfolding reality of the patient's needs. He was a textbook surgeon in a world that had thrown the book away. The sheer volume of trauma, the messy, unpredictable nature of it all, was overwhelming his carefully constructed facade of competence. "I need a full workup on the driver from the sedan," he'd shout, only for a paramedic to yell back, "He's coding, Doc. We don't have time." He was flustered, his focus scattered. He was trying to manage everything at once, and in doing so, was managing nothing. His interns, including Sarah, were left scrambling, trying to make sense of his contradictory commands. In the midst of this maelstrom, Evelyn Reed was an island of preternatural calm. She had been floated down to the ER from her ward, expected to perform basic tasks like stocking supplies and taking vitals. But as the bodies poured in, she began to move. There was no wasted motion. Every step had a purpose. While others ran, she walked with a deliberate speed that was somehow faster, more effective. She wasn't giving orders, not in the way Finch was. She was making quiet observations that changed outcomes. She'd pass a gurney and murmur to a harried resident, "Check his pupils again. Left side is sluggish. I think his bleed is expanding." An hour later, the CT scan would confirm a life-threatening epidural hematoma that the resident had nearly missed. She saw a young woman, pale and shivering, being triaged for minor cuts. Everyone assumed she was in shock from the accident. Evelyn took one look at her, at the subtle distension of her abdomen, and laid a hand gently on her stomach. She looked at the paramedic. "She's pregnant, 3rd trimester, and she's having contractions. That's not shock, it's placental abruption. Get her to OB/GYN, now, STAT." The paramedic, seeing the absolute certainty in her eyes, didn't question it. He ran. Sarah Jenkins watched, mesmerized. It was like watching a grandmaster play chess while everyone else was slapping checkers. Evelyn saw the whole board. She would glance at a patient from 10 feet away and seem to absorb their entire condition in a single, sweeping look. She'd spot a tension pneumothorax by the slight, asymmetrical rise of a patient's chest from across the room. She'd identify the specific chemical burn on a firefighter's arm by its scent alone. It wasn't just experience. It was something deeper. An instinct. A 6th sense for trauma honed to a razor's edge. Finch, in his chaotic orbit, finally noticed her. He saw this quiet, old nurse moving with purpose, saw other staff beginning to turn to her for guidance, their instincts recognizing true competence, even if their minds didn't. He saw his authority, already crumbling under the pressure of the MCI, being silently usurped. His insecurity, raw and exposed, erupted as rage. He cornered her by the ambulance bay, grabbing her arm. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. Evelyn didn't react, her eyes calm. "Triaging, doctor." "You are not a triage officer. You are a floor nurse. I am in charge here," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. The veins on his neck stood out. "Every time I turn around, you are undermining me, countermanding my authority. I've had it with you." He was losing control completely, his professional mask stripped away to reveal the panicked tyrant beneath. He jabbed a finger into her chest, his voice dropping to a low, vicious threat. "One more move, one more word out of line, and I will personally see to it that you not only lose your job, but your nursing license as well. You'll be lucky to get a job cleaning toilets in a bus station. Do you understand me?" He wanted her to cry. He wanted her to beg. He wanted her to show the fear that was currently eating him alive. Evelyn simply looked at him. Her gaze was unnerving, not because it was angry, but because it was evaluative. She was looking at him the way she looked at a failing piece of equipment. She gave a single, sharp nod. Understood. Infuriated by her composure, he shoved a stack of paperwork into her chest. "Good. Now go to Central Supply and do a full inventory. I want you out of my ER. Stay out of the way until I say otherwise." Evelyn took the paperwork without a word. She turned and walked away, her limp more pronounced than Sarah had ever seen it. It was the walk of a soldier ordered to stand down while the battle raged on. A retreat more painful than any wound. Sarah watched her go, a cold dread filling her. Dr. Finch hadn't just disciplined a nurse. He had disarmed his most powerful weapon, and he was too blind to even know it. The chaos of the mass casualty incident had just begun to subside when a new, more focused wave of panic washed over the hospital. It came in the form of Margaret Vance, the hospital administrator. Her face pale and her movements bird-like and frantic. She hurried into the ER, her high heels clicking an urgent staccato on the linoleum. "Clear the helipad. I need OR3 prepped and on standby now," she announced, her voice tight with anxiety. "Priority 1 air transport, ETA 5 minutes." A hush fell over the exhausted ER staff. A Priority 1 airlift meant someone incredibly important was coming. This wasn't part of the highway pileup. This was different. This was political. Dr. Finch saw his opportunity. The MCI had been a near fiasco for him, a chaotic mess that had exposed his weaknesses. But this was a single, high-profile patient, a chance to reclaim his glory in a controlled environment. He smoothed his scrubs, composing his face back into its familiar mask of confident authority. "I'll take lead," he declared, stepping forward to meet Vance. "What's the nature of the incident?" "That's classified," Vance snapped, clearly out of her depth. "All I know is it's a VIP from the nearby military base, a training accident, and he's critical." The thwump, thwump, thwump of helicopter blades grew from a distant hum to a deafening roar that vibrated through the building. On the rooftop helipad, a sleek, black military helicopter, a stark contrast to the civilian life flight choppers, touched down. The side doors slid open before the skids were even fully settled. A team of 4 medics in tactical gear and dark, serious expressions disembarked, moving with a fluid, lethal grace. They surrounded a gurney, forming a human shield around the patient. As they hustled the gurney into the elevator, the ER staff caught a glimpse of the man. He was older, with silver hair matted with blood. His uniform was torn and stained. Despite the pain and the layers of emergency medical equipment, he carried an undeniable aura of command. This was General Marcus Thorne. Finch met them at the elevator doors, puffing out his chest. "I am Dr. Finch, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery here at St. Jude's. I'll be taking charge of the case. Get him to OR 3 now." The leader of the military medical team, a major with cold, intelligent eyes, gave Finch a quick, dismissive up-and-down glance. He clearly wasn't impressed, but protocol was protocol in a civilian facility. "Understood, Doctor. He has multiple penetrating shrapnel wounds to the chest and abdomen, significant internal hemorrhaging, and a compromised airway. He's unstable." "I've handled worse," Finch lied, his voice a smooth balm of false confidence. As the controlled chaos of the military team and hospital staff swirled toward the operating wing, Finch spotted Evelyn. She had just returned from her exile in Central Supply, her inventory task complete. She was doing what she always did, seeing a need and quietly filling it. She was ensuring the pathway to the OR was clear, moving a stray gurney out of the way, checking that the blood bank runner was on standby. Finch, high on the adrenaline of the moment and eager to assert his dominance in front of the stoic military personnel, saw her as a final, easy target to solidify his command. He pointed a finger at her. "You, Nurse Reed." Evelyn looked up, her face impassive. "Go to the doctor's lounge and make sure there's a fresh pot of coffee. The military team will need it after." It was a demeaning, pointless task, designed to underscore her irrelevance. He then leaned in closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper laced with malice. "And this time, stay out. Stay out of the hallway, stay out of the gallery, and for God's sake, stay out of the operating theater. We have professionals in there. A man's life is at stake." Evelyn stared at him for a long moment. Her eyes seemed to look right through him, seeing the quivering insecurity he papered over with bluster. She gave no visible reaction, no flicker of anger or hurt. She just nodded. "Coffee. Understood, Doctor." She turned and walked toward the lounge, her movements deliberate, unhurried. Finch watched her go with a smug smile. The old bat was finally learning her place. He turned back to his prize, the dying general, ready to perform the heroic surgery that would be the talk of the city. He had no idea he had just dismissed the only person in the entire hospital who could actually save him. The atmosphere in Operating Room 3 was electric with tension. The sterile field was an island of blue fabric in a sea of gleaming steel and anxious faces. On the table, General Marcus Thorne lay perilously close to death. The military's field interventions had kept him alive on the flight over, but they were temporary plugs in a rapidly sinking ship. Dr. Finch stood at the head of the table, the surgical lights glinting off the sweat on his brow. He had made the initial incision, his movements textbook perfect. But this was not a textbook case. The shrapnel from the training accident, more likely an explosion, had not followed neat, predictable paths. It had torn through tissue, ripped across organs, and created a nightmare of internal damage. "Suction," Finch commanded, his voice tight. "I can't find the primary bleeder. The entire peritoneal cavity is flooded." The anesthesiologist at the head of the table, a veteran named Dr. Ramirez, called out the grim numbers. "Blood pressure is 60/40 and still dropping, Alistair. He's massively tachycardic. We're pouring in O-neg as fast as we can, but we're losing him." Finch probed deeper, his movements growing more frantic. He was a master of the clean, scheduled heart surgery, the predictable bypass. This chaotic, messy trauma was a foreign language he couldn't speak. He saw a bleed near the spleen and began packing it with laparotomy pads, a standard procedure. But the bleeding didn't slow. If anything, the pressure in the abdomen seemed to increase. The monitors shrieked a fresh wave of alarms. "It's not working," Finch yelled, his voice cracking. In a moment of pure panic, his hand slipped. The tip of his forceps, intended to place a clamp, instead nicked a mesenteric vessel. A fresh, arterial spurt of bright red blood joined the dark, venous pool. "Damn it," he swore. The team exchanged panicked glances. Their god was not only failing, he was making things worse. Outside the OR, in the sterile corridor, Evelyn Reed was holding a fresh tray of surgical instruments she'd been asked to fetch. She had not gone to make coffee. Her instincts, her very being, had refused the order. She knew this situation was volatile. Through the small square window in the OR door, she could see the vitals monitor. She saw the pressure drop below 60. She saw the number 50 flash, then 48. She saw the frantic, useless movements of Finch's hands. She knew what was happening. She had seen this exact injury pattern a dozen times before, in dusty, makeshift operating bays, where the only light was a headlamp and the only suction was a hand pump. Finch was looking in the front yard while the house was burning down from the inside. She couldn't stand by. Not again. The promise she had made to herself, to stay quiet, to stay hidden, was shattered by a more ancient, more powerful vow. First, do no harm. And letting that arrogant fool continue was the greatest harm of all. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The surgical team flinched at the intrusion. "Dr. Finch," she said. Her voice was not the soft, hesitant murmur of the ward nurse. It was a new sound, a blade of cold steel. "You're wrong. You're missing it." Finch whirled around, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. "Get out! I told you to stay out. Security! Get this woman out of my OR!" But Evelyn's eyes were not on him. They were locked on the surgical field, her mind processing the data with terrifying speed. She ignored his screeching as if it were the buzz of a fly. "His primary injury isn't the spleen," she stated, her voice cutting through the panic. "The blast wave caused a shearing injury to his lumbar artery. He has a massive, expanding retroperitoneal hematoma. That's why his pressure is bottoming out and you can't find the source. It's all happening behind the curtain." You have approximately 90 seconds before he goes into irreversible disseminated intravascular coagulation and bleeds out from every orifice. The entire room froze. The level of diagnostic precision, the calm certainty, the sheer impossibility of it. It stunned them all into silence. Sarah Jenkins, who had managed to get into the OR as a junior assistant, felt the hair on her arms stand up. Before Finch could form a coherent, sputtering reply, Evelyn moved. She stepped past him, her presence suddenly immense. She pointed to a specific spot deep within the abdominal cavity, a place Finch hadn't even considered. You need to perform a medial visceral rotation. Get the spleen and pancreas out of the way. Then you'll need to apply a transverse aortic clamp just below the diaphragm to get control. Now. Finch was paralyzed, caught between his shredded ego and the undeniable authority in her voice. He just stood there, clamp in hand, looking lost. Evelyn didn't wait. With a movement that was not violent but was utterly unstoppable, she placed her hand on his chest and moved him aside. "Move," she said. The word was not a request. It was an order. She took the instruments from the tray. Her hands, which hours ago had been gently helping a man with his lunch tray, became a blur of motion. They moved with a speed and precision that was breathtaking, almost inhuman. It was not the work of a nurse. It was the work of a master, a virtuoso at the peak of her powers. She performed the complex visceral rotation, exposing the hidden, catastrophic bleeding behind the organs. The source, a tear in the major artery, was exactly where she said it would be. With a series of deft, economical movements, she clamped the vessel. The torrential bleeding slowed to a manageable ooze. "Pressure is stabilizing," Dr. Ramirez called out, his voice filled with disbelief and awe. "It's coming up. 80/50. He's back with us." In that sudden, blessed quiet, as the monitors began to sing a song of stability instead of failure, the general's eyelids fluttered. Through a haze of drugs and near death, his gaze fell upon the woman working so intently to save him. He saw the furrow of concentration on her brow, the familiar, silvery scar above her eyebrow, illuminated by the harsh surgical light. A flicker of memory, of a dusty, desperate rescue 10 years ago, pierced through the fog. His voice was a dry rasp, a ghost of a sound, but every person in the room heard it. "Nightingale, is that you?" The code name hung in the super-chilled air of the operating room, a word of impossible weight and mystery. Nightingale. It meant nothing to most, but it was a key, and it had just unlocked a door that had been sealed for a decade. Dr. Finch, shoved aside and publicly neutered, finally found his voice. The shock and confusion curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. His entire world, his carefully curated image of brilliance and authority, had been shattered by an old nurse. "She assaulted me," he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Evelyn. "She laid hands on me and interfered with a critical surgical procedure. Security! Arrest this woman! I want her charged." 2 hospital security guards, burly men used to dealing with delirious patients or distraught family members, shuffled uncertainly into the OR, drawn by Finch's shouts. They looked at the furious doctor, then at the calm woman who was now calmly instructing the rest of the surgical team, and were utterly confused. Before they could take a step, the major from the military medevac team, who had been observing the entire incident from the corner with a look of growing astonishment, stepped forward. He held up a hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of absolute command. "Stand down," he ordered the security guards. His voice was quiet but resonated with an authority that dwarfed Finch's hysterical screeching. The guards stopped dead in their tracks, The major then turned his full attention to Evelyn. He was no longer looking at a nurse. He was looking at a superior officer. Awe, respect, and a dawning, profound reverence were plain on his face. He completely ignored the sputtering Dr. Finch. "Ma'am?" he asked, his voice laced with deference. "What are your orders?" The word "ma'am" hit the room like a physical blow. Finch staggered back as if he'd been struck. Evelyn didn't look up from her patient. The general was stable, but the work was far from over. "Get me General Thorne's full classified field medical file," she commanded, her voice the epitome of calm, battlefield authority. "Priority Alpha, now. And get Hospital Administrator Vance and the Chief of Staff in here immediately. Dr. Finch is relieved of his duties on this case. He is not to touch my patient again." My patient. The words, spoken with such quiet, irrefutable ownership, were the final humiliation. "Your patient?" Finch spluttered, his face turning a mottled shade of purple. "You are a nurse, a nobody. I am the chief of surgery. I will have you in prison for this. You'll never work in medicine again." Right on cue, Margaret Vance bustled in, drawn by the urgent summons and the escalating chaos. She took in the scene at a glance, her star surgeon being sidelined by a lowly nurse. Her instinct for political preservation kicked in instantly. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. She rounded on Evelyn. "Nurse Reed, you have crossed a line you cannot imagine. You are fired, effective immediately. And I assure you, you will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Just as the words left her mouth, a young airman from the military team sprinted into the OR, carrying a ruggedized, military-grade tablet computer. He handed it to the major, saluted, and stepped back. The major's eyes scanned the screen. His expression shifted from awe to something approaching religious veneration. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the enraged Dr. Finch and the indignant Administrator Vance. He held up the tablet. "Both of you," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You're going to want to be very quiet now." The unspoken threat in his tone was more terrifying than any of Finch's shouting. A heavy, portentous silence descended upon the room, broken only by the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. A sound that was a testament to the woman Finch had just tried to destroy. The operating room had become a courtroom, and judgment was about to be rendered. Evelyn continued her work, her hands moving with fluid grace as she repaired the delicate, torn tissues around the lumbar artery. The rest of the surgical team, including the senior anesthesiologist and the other attending surgeons who had been assisting Finch, now followed her quiet directives without hesitation. They had witnessed a miracle, a display of skill so far beyond their own experience that it commanded nothing less than total obedience. The major stood before the bewildered chief of staff, Dr. Albright, and the still fuming Margaret Vance. Dr. Finch hovered behind them, a study in impotent fury. The major held the military tablet so they could all see the screen. Displayed was an official Department of Defense personnel file. At the top was a photograph of a woman in her mid-40s, her face unsmiling, her hair pulled back severely under a formal Army service cap. Her uniform jacket was adorned with a dizzying array of ribbons and medals. It was unmistakably a younger Evelyn Reed, her eyes containing the same focused intensity they held now. "Do you know who this is?" the major asked, his voice filling the silent room. He didn't wait for an answer. "This," he began, his tone imbued with the gravitas of a eulogy for a hero who, it turned out, was not dead, "is Colonel Evelyn Reed, United States Army Medical Corps. Her operational call sign, known only to a select few in the special operations community, was Nightingale. Finch let out a choked, hysterical bark of laughter. "Colonel? Her? That's preposterous. She's an old broken-down floor nurse. This is some kind of elaborate joke." The Major's eyes, cold as chips of ice, locked onto Finch. "It is not a joke, Doctor." He began to read from the file on the tablet, his voice a relentless cadence of honor and valor. Colonel Reed is the recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, our nation's second highest award for valor, for her actions during Operation Viper's Nest in 2008. She established a functioning surgical theater in a collapsed building under sustained enemy fire and performed 17 consecutive, life-saving trauma surgeries over a period of 36 hours. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. The faces of the hospital staff were masks of disbelief. "She is also the recipient of 2 Silver Stars," he continued. 4 Bronze Stars for valor and the Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat. He swiped the screen, moving deeper into the file. "She is not just a surgeon. She is an innovator. She single-handedly developed the Nightingale Protocol for far-forward blood transfusion using whole blood, a technique that has saved hundreds of lives and is now standard doctrine for the 75th Ranger Regiment, Delta Force, and Navy SEALs. The complex aortic clamping procedure she just used to save General Thorne's life. It has a name in our manuals. It's called the Reed Maneuver. She invented it, in the field, in the dark, using a Leatherman multi-tool and a sterilized piece of shrapnel to create a makeshift clamp." He looked directly at Dr. Finch, his gaze pitiless. "Doctor, this woman has logged more successful surgical hours in active war zones than you have in this pristine, sterile palace. The men who died on her table didn't die because of incompetence. They died because they'd been hit by rocket-propelled grenades. She has held the hands of more dying American heroes than you have shaken at glitzy donor galas. She has operated in sandstorms, in sub-zero temperatures, and in the back of violently moving helicopters. Your worst day in this OR wouldn't even qualify as a minor inconvenience in her world." The color had completely drained from Alistair Finch's face. He looked like a statue carved from chalk. Margaret Vance's mouth was hanging open, her carefully constructed world of politics and influence crumbling around her. In the corner, Sarah Jenkins was openly weeping, tears of vindication and awe streaming down her face. The rest of the staff, nurses, technicians, surgeons, stared at Evelyn's back with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons. This quiet, unassuming woman they had ignored, condescended to, and dismissed was a giant, a legend walking among them. The Major scrolled to the final entry in the file. "Colonel Reed took an honorable medical retirement 10 years ago after being critically wounded by an IED blast during the combat rescue of a downed F-16 pilot in the Korengal Valley. Her actions that day saved the pilot's life and the lives of 3 other members of the rescue team." He lifted his eyes from the tablet and gestured with his chin toward the man on the operating table. "The pilot she pulled from that burning wreckage, shielding him with her own body, was a young captain named Marcus Thorne." He turned off the tablet. The ensuing silence was absolute, heavier than any sound. Then, the Major did something that shattered the last vestiges of the old reality. He turned to face Evelyn, who was now placing the final suture. He squared his shoulders, drew himself up to his full, imposing height, and brought his right hand up in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. "Colonel Reed," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "it is an honor to serve with you again, ma'am." One by one, the other 3 members of the elite military medical team followed his lead. They clicked their heels on the tiled floor and rendered their own crisp salutes. A line of 4 battle-hardened special operations medics, standing at rigid attention, saluting the back of a middle-aged woman in simple blue scrubs. It was a gesture of profound respect, a ceremony of recognition so powerful it left everyone else in the room breathless. Dr. Finch, cornered and exposed, made one last pathetic attempt to salvage his reality. His mind simply couldn't process the magnitude of his error. This is insane. I don't care who she was. This is St. Jude's Hospital, not some dusty army base. She has no surgical privileges here. She violated every protocol. She assaulted a superior. I am pressing charges for battery, and I'm suing her and this hospital for it. His desperate tirade was cut short as the OR doors swung open with a quiet, authoritative hiss. 2 men in dark, impeccably tailored suits entered, flanking a third man with the grim, weary face of a career federal prosecutor. They ignored everyone else and walked directly to Finch. "Dr. Alastair Finch?" the prosecutor asked, his voice calm and devoid of emotion. "We're from the Department of Justice, National Security Division." Finch's jaw, which had been working so furiously, snapped shut. "The what?" "General Marcus Thorne is not just a soldier, Doctor," the prosecutor explained patiently, as if to a child. "He is a person of critical national strategic importance. The data he carries in his head is invaluable. Your gross malpractice, which has been meticulously documented by this room's audiovisual black box recorder, nearly cost this country one of its most vital assets. Under the expanded definitions of the Patriot Act, that qualifies as an act of gross negligence endangering national security." Finch looked as if he'd been shot. "What? That's not possible. It was a complicated procedure." The second agent, a tall man with impassive eyes, held up a thick legal document. "Furthermore, we have a warrant to investigate your entire surgical case history. Roughly 30 minutes ago, the Attorney General's office received a detailed, anonymous tip via a secure server. This tip alleges a pattern of behavior that includes, but is not limited to, falsifying post-operative reports to hide errors, billing fraud, and taking credit for complex procedures performed by junior surgeons whom you then intimidated into silence." From her corner, Sarah Jenkins looked down at the floor, a small, fierce, triumphant smile playing on her lips. Her anonymous tip, sent from a burner email app on her phone the second she understood the significance of the name Nightingale, had found its target. She had loaded the weapon, and Colonel Reed had given her the courage to pull the trigger. Margaret Vance, seeing her entire world imploding, tried to play her last, pathetic card. "Now, hold on. This is a terrible misunderstanding. Dr. Finch's family they are very significant donors to this hospital. They sit on the board." The prosecutor turned his cold, tired eyes on her. "Administrator Vance, your attempt to protect Dr. Finch, coupled with your illegal summary termination of a decorated federal officer who was acting under the Good Samaritan doctrine to prevent a catastrophic loss of life, has been duly noted. The board will be advised. I would suggest you clear out your desk. Your career in hospital administration is over." Vance wilted, her face turning the color of ash. The 2 agents stepped forward and flanked Dr. Finch. "Dr. Alastair Finch, you are under arrest." One of them produced a pair of handcuffs, the click of the ratchet echoing loudly in the silent room. As they cuffed him, Finch began to crumble. The arrogance, the bluster, all of it evaporated, leaving behind a whimpering, terrified man-child. "No. Please. You don't understand. I'm a surgeon." They marched him out of the OR. The hallway outside, once empty, was now crowded with dozens of hospital staff, nurses, doctors, technicians, orderlies, who had been drawn by the incredible story that was spreading through St. Jude's like wildfire. They parted like the Red Sea to let the disgraced surgeon and his escorts pass. There was no jeering, no mockery, just a sea of cold, silent, contemptuous faces. It was the public humiliation he had so enjoyed inflicting on others returned to him 1,000-fold. As he was led away, a slow, solitary clap echoed in the hallway. It was Sarah Jenkins. Then another nurse joined in, then a resident, and another. Within seconds, the entire corridor erupted in thunderous applause. But the applause wasn't for Finch's downfall. It was for the quiet, unassuming hero in blue scrubs who stood, back still to them, having just saved a life and reclaimed a legend. 6 months later, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings hung in the air. St. Jude's Medical Center had a new wing, a gleaming testament to change. A large, brushed steel sign over the entrance read, "The Colonel Evelyn Reed Center for Advanced Trauma and Emergency Medicine." It had been funded by a combination of a massive, unsolicited grant from the Department of Defense and an equally massive, though far more reluctant, charitable donation from the disgraced Finch family, a desperate act of public penance to stave off further legal and social ruin. Inside, the center was the most advanced of its kind in the nation. Evelyn Reed stood before a group of new residents, her first class of trainees. The worn, faded scrubs were gone, replaced by a crisp, professional uniform beneath a pristine white lab coat. The perpetual weariness in her eyes had been replaced by a focused, brilliant fire. Her limp was still there, a permanent reminder of her past. But she no longer tried to hide it. She carried it with a quiet dignity, a badge of honor, not a mark of infirmity. She was no longer Nurse Reed. She was Director Reed, Colonel Reed. Standing just behind her, a proud and capable second-in-command, was Dr. Sarah Jenkins. Promoted to chief resident of the new center, she was Evelyn's hand-picked protege, her idealism now tempered with a core of steel she had learned from her mentor. The dedication ceremony was attended by a host of dignitaries, but Evelyn only had eyes for one of them. General Marcus Thorne, fully recovered and looking formidable in his dress uniform, stood beside her. After the speeches, they shared a quiet moment by a window overlooking the city. "You know," the general said, a warm smile touching his lips, "I always knew you couldn't stay in the shadows forever, Nightingale. Some lights are just too bright to hide." Evelyn's hand went to her lapel. Pinned there for all the world to see was the small steel Nightingale pin. It was no longer a hidden secret, but a public declaration. "I wasn't hiding, Marcus," she replied, her voice soft but sure. "I was just resting." The karmic wheel had turned for everyone. Margaret Vance was gone, forced into an early and ignominious retirement. The chief of staff, Dr. Albright, had been replaced by a new leader who embraced the culture of competence and respect that Evelyn was building. And Alistair Finch. His family's money had kept him out of prison, pleading his national security charge down to a lesser offense. But his medical license had been permanently revoked. His name was a curse in the medical community. The final scene of his downfall was not a dramatic courtroom conviction, but a pathetic, quiet epilogue. He was in a small, drab conference room at a rural community clinic, demonstrating a new type of urinary catheter to a handful of bored, unimpressed nurses. His expensive suit hung on him strangely, and his once charismatic smile was now a desperate, pleading rictus. A young nurse, squinting at him, finally placed his face. "Hey," she said, not unkindly. "Weren't you that surgeon from the news? The one at St. Jude's?" Finch flinched as if he'd been struck. A dark flush crept up his neck. "No," he mumbled, his eyes darting away. "No, that wasn't me. You're mistaken." He hastily threw his demonstration models into a briefcase, snapped it shut, and practically fled the room, his shoulders slumped in a posture of permanent, inescapable shame. Back in her new kingdom, Evelyn Reed walked the floor of her trauma center. She saw a young nurse, barely out of school, her hands trembling as she struggled to place an IV line in the arm of a frightened patient. The nurse was on her third try, her face flushed with frustration and embarrassment. Evelyn didn't shout. She didn't reprimand. She didn't humiliate. She walked over, her footsteps quiet and reassuring. She placed a gentle hand on the young nurse's shoulder. The nurse flinched, expecting a rebuke. "It's all right," Evelyn said, her voice the same soft, kind tone she had used with her patients for years. "That's a tricky vein. Let me show you a little trick I learned a long time ago." She didn't take the needle from her. Instead, she gently guided the young nurse's hands with her own, adjusting the angle, showing her how to feel for the vessel's path. "There," she whispered. "Right there. You can do it." The nurse took a deep breath and, under Evelyn's steadying guidance, slid the needle in perfectly. The hidden hero was hidden no more, but her true nature, to heal, to teach, to lift up those around her, to care, had not changed. She had sought peace in the quiet shadows of anonymity, but she had found it here in the bright light of her own accepted truth. Her brilliance no longer a burden, but a beacon for all to see. If this story of a hidden hero finally getting the recognition she deserved touched your heart and made you cheer, then please take a moment to smash that like button. It truly makes a difference and helps our channel grow, allowing us to bring more stories like this to you. Our goal is to reach 100,000 likes on this video, and with your help, we can do it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a tale of justice and vindication. If you know someone who has ever felt overlooked or underestimated, share this story with them. It might be the inspiration they need. And for our question of the day, who was the person in your life who saw your true potential when no one else did? Tell me about your nightingale in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.